Hi Adele, hi Michelle, welcome back to Beaver curling Logtossers. Today I'm going to be reviewing the 2022 film Persuasion, which, as we're recording this, only came out yesterday. No one requested me to review this, but the film hath angered me so, and so I want to talk about it and get it off my chest. And I run this YouTube channel so I can do what I like because no one listens to these. Um, yeah, and I know in doing this, all I'm doing is joining the hordes of angry people online, because I have no originality, but neither do the creators of this film, so I think it's fair enough. So a few notes on Persuasion. I'm not going to go through it in too much detail. It's like a simple enough story. I'll talk about it during the review a little bit. Persuasion is probably my favourite Jane Austen book. I do bounce between which one's my favourite, but honestly, Persuasion I read very, very recently. I read it in Spanish to help learn Spanish, but also because I just love the book. I think it's great. I also love the previous adaptations, 2007 and 1995. 1995 is my favourite with Amanda Root and Kieran Hines, but I do think 2007 stands on its own. And so I would say I genuinely think Persuasion 2022 is possibly the worst Jane Austen adaptation I have ever seen. That's not saying much because most of the ones I have seen are pretty good. Both Pride and Prejudices are good, both Sense and Sensibilities are good, although one is much better than the other. The other Persuasions are good. Northanger Abbey, the one I've seen of that, is good. The only other one I can think that kind of competes is that I've seen three Mansfield Park adaptations and none of them were particularly good, but I do think this one was worse. So I think this is my least favourite Jane Austen adaptation I've ever seen. So it's a bit of a shame that you have this sort of genre which is sort of generally held up well, and even though people have different favourite adaptations, there aren't that many bad ones, and this is kind of, I think a lot of people are quite upset by this. Although I would say it is weaker than the other adaptations, which is obviously damaging it. It's not completely without merit. It's not a horrendously terrible film. It's not the worst film in the world. And so if you're listening to this and you enjoyed it, that's fair enough. I'll talk about why I didn't enjoy it that much, but I will talk about some of the things that it did well. It's not a film without merit, so I don't want anyone to feel bad because they enjoyed it. I personally didn't like it because I'm a lover of the book. If you don't have that same relationship, fair enough if you liked it. One thing I also would say, I've only watched this film once and I didn't know that I was going to review it when I was watching it, so I didn't have my notebook, I wasn't taking notes. I'm reviewing this from memory, so kind of the lasting impression that it's made on me, but I'm never watching this film again. I have no desire to watch it again. I think to start with, I did want to talk about my thoughts of adaptations in general. I'm a huge reader. I love reading. I love watching films of books that I've read. So with adaptations, I will say it is incredibly difficult to make an adaptation of a book, or even things like comic books and stuff. It's difficult to make an adaptation. There are, the time restraints. Films are generally shorter than books. Lots of people interpret books in different ways. Everyone visualizes something in a different way. So, even say things like the Harry Potter films, which are generally very highly regarded, there are still people who don't like them because they don't look the way that they envisioned it in their head. That is always going to be an issue. And just the act of transposing something onto film or onto a TV series, it's difficult. It does require a lot of hard work. I think there is a huge difference between something that is objectively a bad adaptation and something that does not fit your view. Persuasion, of course, this film will fit in between these somewhere, where to some extent I don't think it's a good adaptation, but also to a huge extent it's just the one that does not fit my view of the novel, and that is a subjective view. I had the same, with other adaptations. Jane Eyre is possibly my favourite book of all time, and there is a scene in that in Jane Eyre 2006 where that is a very popular adaptation of the book, and it is a very, very good one, but there are certain scenes in that which don't fit my view, so I don't like them, but then other readers haven't been bothered by them because they think they're absolutely fine. So for me, I try and not to decide whether or not an adaptation is right or wrong, but whether it's made well or made badly. I think that is kind of, if you say something, you can't say something was adapted wrong or adapted right, because that's too subjective, but you can say from your opinion something was adapted well or adapted poorly. So that is kind of what I'm going to be sticking to, and again, people are going to disagree on this. I think, honestly, of all my reviews, this is going to be my most subjective one, because Persuasion, unlike my other books, unlike my other things, reviews, I haven't gone into them with many preconceived notions. I guess Bridgerton would be the only one where I'd read the books and I'd seen the previous series. I guess also with Harlan Coben, I'd had a few preconceived things about that, but even Stay Close, that series, I didn't really have a relationship with it. Persuasion, I do have, I would say, like a kind of relationship with the novel. I love this novel. I'm very attached to it, so that has affected me a bit. One thing I also would say is that even when something is not adapted well, it is still possible to make a good film. So David Copperfield, the 2019 version, I don't think that's a good adaptation of the book David Copperfield. David Copperfield is another book that I love. I'm very attached to it. It's my favourite Dickens book, other than maybe Bleak House or Great Expectation. Dickens books, it does actually change all the time. But for a long time, David Copperfield was my favourite Dickens book. I don't think David Copperfield the film is a good adaptation, but it's still a great film. It's still very, very good film. It's very easily watchable. Same with things like The Shining. The Shining is, I think a lot of people agree, it's a great film. Not everyone likes it, but it's still a great, well-made film. It's just that it's not a great adaptation of the novel. So you can still enjoy something that is not a good adaptation. Writers and directors ultimately do have the right to make stylistic changes. They are making a completely new piece of media. They have to create the mood and setting. They have to decide what gets cut from the novel, and maybe if they want to add things in. A film is different to a book. You can't do the exact same things. So ultimately, directors do have, and writers and producers or whoever, they have the right to make stylistic changes, and have their work regarded as their own work, rather than a piece of Jane Austen's work. So this film isn't necessarily, it's not made by Jane Austen, it's just based on her work, but other people have worked on this, and as creators deserve to have their own sort of footprint set in it. I think one of the best examples of this is the film Jaws. Again, it's a film that a lot of people would argue a brilliant film. Some people have called it the greatest film of all time. It's definitely one of the greatest films of all time. But that is a film where, in order to capture elements of the book, they had to add stuff in to create the mood and the setting, to create this tension, and also had to change a lot from the book. But also, it was adapted by Steven Spielberg, who we all know is, a phenomenal director. So he kind of needed the liberty to adapt it in a different way, in order to create this great piece of media. I think this is just summarising. It's difficult to make adaptations. Adaptations are very subjective, and also you can adapt something poorly. Writers and directors can adapt something poorly or be inspired by something but not completely follow it through, and still but make their own piece of media, which is theirs, which they have worked on, being creative with, and it still turn out really, really well. So I'm not having a go at all adaptations in this, but I will be viewing Persuasion as an adaptation of the novel. I think another thing I would say about classics, I don't think this is relevant to Jane Austen, but this is relevant to some classics in general. There are some classics which age a certain way. I guess what you could say with Persuasion is the way it is aged is, in the book, all of the characters are white. That's not debatable. They are all white people. So colourblind casting is a kind of way of modernising it. Colourblind casting has been debatable. I am no authority on it, absolutely not. I have, no right to say whether or not it's good or bad. But ultimately, it is a way of showing how sometimes, these old literary texts do age well, and so when you are adapting them, you do have to have a certain level of awareness when adapting them, that sometimes things do change, sometimes attitudes change. Similarly, in Charles Dickens's books, in many of his books, there aren't very many women in them, so the adaptations have made the few women more prominent characters. I know some versions of Oliver Twist made Nancy a bit more prominent than she was in the books, just because they wanted to have more women in them. So there are certain ways they kind of modernise an adaptation without changing it completely, but they will shift focus, or they will treat a subject in a different way to kind of temper it for modern audiences. It depends on what they're doing and how they're doing it, and the spirit of the original novel. And again, it's one of these things where different people have different perspectives on, but I do understand why people do this. I do understand why certain choices are made. Other things I would say on adaptations, on the other hand, adaptations are made to capitalise on an existing fan base. Persuasion was made because there are Austen fans who wanted to see a Persuasion adaptation. It was a very safe bet for a company to just make a Persuasion adaptation. They don't need to come up with a story or the ideas or the character or anything, so the creative process is a lot easier in some regards. They still do have to adapt it, so it's not completely effort-free, but it's not the same as pitching a completely original idea and having to workshop that. And also, people are always going to compare if something is an adaptation or a remake. That is just, studios know this when they go into making an adaptation or a remake. They are aware that people are going to compare them, and they knowingly take the risk. So it's when people say it's not fair to always take a film and only review it as an adaptation, or to compare it to other adaptations. No, it's completely fair, because they haven't put all the work in when it comes to the creative process, and also they know this going in. They know this going in because they are doing it in order to capitalise on people who either liked the previous films or have read the book. When you get to adaptations, there is always the, subjective question of how good is the story that they told versus the story they could have told, whether or not it's a story closer to the book or taking the book in a different direction. This is always a subjective question, but film is always subjective, and people are allowed to have their own opinions, and you kind of need to accept the reviews as they come. So that is just a few thoughts on adaptations. They're complicated, it's not that straightforward, and it's not always fair to say a adaptation is a pass or a fail, but also there are reasons why they are reviewed as adaptations or as remakes, and why they are compared to other pieces of media. To my mind, it is fair enough. So I will be comparing it to the other films, and I will be comparing it to the book, even though some people haven't been doing that. I also wanted to say, so I went on Twitter, which is always a dangerous idea, to look at the reviews. I think a lot of people were kind of on my side of things of not enjoying the film that much. I will get into my issues with the film in a few minutes, but this is my thing. So I just saw so many kind of straw man arguments from people who liked the film, talking about why people didn't like the film. So some people kept saying that, people didn't like the film because of the colourblind casting. In fairness, I did see a fair few tweets about people who didn't like the casting. There were a couple of tweets like that. But there are many, many, many people who dislike the film for other reasons. As with things like Bridgerton, David Copperfield, as I mentioned, which I didn't think was a great adaptation. Other, books and films. It doesn't matter whether or not it's got colourblind casting. If I don't like it, I don't like it. I won't like something for the sake of it having colourblind casting. I thought David Copperfield was a good film. I love Hamilton. Cinderella 1997 is one of my favourites. I don't want to name drop all these things just because I know how that sounds. But I'm not going to like something for the sake of it having colourblind casting. I will always encourage, it for studios. I'm kind of on board with it in most circumstances, not all. But that's like a whole other thing. That's a whole other debate. So fair enough, I will keep encouraging period dramas with, diverse cast and everything. That's fine. I'm not going to like it just because it has a diverse cast. It has to be a good film too. And I didn't see that many people who hated the film because of the diverse cast. People had other issues with it. Also, people kind of kept saying, oh, people didn't like it because it broke the fourth wall. And again, that's not something I saw much of. My personal feeling is that I had no problem with them breaking the fourth wall, but I just didn't think they used it well. They kept comparing it to Fleabag. They said it was like the Jane Austen meets Fleabag. But Fleabag, you know, when Fleabag broke the fourth wall, it was used very effectively. But, you know, fourth wall should be used to convey something to a viewer which other characters aren't supposed to know. It's a way of a main character addressing the viewer without addressing the main characters. Fleabag always did it really, really well, and with, you know, a lot of subtlety and a lot of nuance and a lot of complexity. This one doesn't. I will get into it a bit later when I talk about kind of the writing of the film, but people weren't complaining about it because it broke the fourth wall, or at least not many people did. Some people don't like that style and wouldn't have enjoyed it, but generally people had other issues with the film. I just got really annoyed by people who enjoyed the film having real straw man arguments, calling us like gatekeeper stands, you know, whereas the thing is, the reason that they've made this film is for people who love Persuasion, is because people who love Persuasion will watch it. I love Persuasion and I watched it. That is why they made the film. That is how they made money from the film. So it's fair enough if it was kind of made for us, but we didn't like it. Yes, it was made for other people too. Lots of people who, you know, aren't into the books and aren't into Austen still watched it and would have still enjoyed it, and, you know, your opinion is still valid on it and everything. But the reason why this film was so marketable was because there was a fan base, and so the fan base, I do think, deserves to have an opinion. And if the opinion is that it wasn't close enough to the book that it was based on, that is a valid criticism. So I don't think you need to call people gatekeeper stands just to invalidate their opinions. You know, I do try not to invalidate anyone's opinion on this podcast, but that is why I've been kind of tiptoeing around this review. But now, 15 minutes into the episode, I will start talking about my issues with this adaptation. So, issue number 1. This is so cringy. I do not like cringe humour. That is a personal dislike. But this film is so cringy. The humour in it is so cringy. And it made me stop watching the film about 20 minutes in. I stopped watching it and I decided I wasn't going to watch it, but then later I forced myself to keep going. The cringiest bits are definitely at the beginning. It softens towards the end, but just the humour did not work for me. It made it difficult to watch. And I think one thing I would say, even though Persuasion is regarded as a more serious novel, Jane Austen still wrote humour into her books really well. It's possible to lift the kind of humour she used and kind of add modern twists and everything, and use her humour in different ways and modernise it a bit. It's possible to change that a bit, but my issue was it wasn't that the original book was not funny. I think this adaptation was trying way too hard to have a really specific type of humour, and it just didn't work for me. I think as well, the humour really forces a lot of characters to act really out of character, even in the way... So some of the characters have been changed for the film, but even in the way that they've been changed, it's not out of character. It still feels out of character for the film versions of everything, if that makes sense. So at some point it just turns Anne into a complete mess. She is supposed to be quite intelligent and capable, but clearly they wanted to turn her into a Fleabag type character who drinks a lot and makes a lot of mistakes. She speaks out about things really, really randomly, and then other times she's very quiet, and, you know, her character was difficult to kind of gauge because they were forcing humour where perhaps it didn't belong. And yet, like I said, I will compare it to the Amanda Root version, which I absolutely love. That has some really funny moments in it that are kind of in keeping with the novel, even though you can tell the director has added them in themselves. So it wouldn't have been impossible to, you know, write humour that was in keeping with the characters, not necessarily with the novel, but with the characters. I the humour did not work for me. I did quite like the scene where Anne was going through her old memories of Wentworth and talking about the stuff that Wentworth had given her. So things like a lock of his hair and the letters and the playlist. We'll talk about the modernisation in a moment. I like that. But the thing is, it's played as a very, very funny scene when either it could have been played as something really, really serious. Well, not really serious, but something semi-serious. Even if there's a bit of like sort of sad humour to it. Or I think it could have been really cute if they'd kind of bookended the scene, where we see later Wentworth has also kept letters, has also done stuff. Because I think that would just be it's just a nice scene. I quite like the scene. It was quite nice, but it just feels weird at the end where you never came back to it. Instead, it kind of feels pointless and like a real exposition tool. I just didn't think it worked, but that's just my opinion on that one particular scene. Major problem number 2, anachronisms. Lots of people have been talking about this, so I don't want to go into it too much, but it just... I didn't like it. I didn't like the anachronistic. Some people might have, but I would say most other period dramas aren't doing this kind of anachronistic thing. And to be honest, I don't think it's a huge issue if you kind of almost... I don't want to say steered into it, but maybe if you kind of made that the point of the film, is that it's all kind of weird. So, I mean, comparing to Bridgerton has, modern songs covered as, sort of Regency sounding music using string quartets and stuff. So they obviously have real anachronistic things in there. But that is kind of the part of the ambience. I have my issues with Bridgerton. You can go listen to that review if you have several hours free. But that is part of this kind of fairy tale setting that they have built. Whereas here it almost felt like they were trying to look so much like it looked so accurate in some places, and they were acting so accurately that it just felt really, really out of place to have these anachronistically written lines and stuff. I think you could have just done a modern adaptation. There are plenty of modern adaptations. We have mixed feelings about them, but some of them are good and some of them aren't. But you could have just done a full-on modern retelling of Persuasion and it would have been fine. And they kind of went for this middle ground of having some of the, setting it in the Regency era and having some of the really dramatic lines like I am half agony, half hope, which I just personally felt blended really poorly with some of the other lines where they're saying things like, yeah, hello, okay, she'll buy it, he's a 10. I honestly felt like it made the script sound lazy. Especially when they were using things like okay, which do a bit of quick research, which you can do if you're a Netflix writer being paid to write something as big as this. Do a bit of quick research. People weren't saying okay or hello back then. It's not that it sounded like quirky and fun. It sounded lazy, and it really loses my sense of immersion. It doesn't feel like it's the Regency era. It feels like people pretending it's the Regency era. And I know that that's what that is, but also when I'm watching something, I want it to feel like the Regency era. I want to feel this historical, I want to feel the history bleeding out of these characters, and it just loses the immersion. The anachronistic lines, I don't particularly think they worked. I think they do ruin some of the original lines for no particular reason. I think if you're going to do a modern adaptation, something like we are no longer strangers, we're exes, is like a kind of funny way, in a modern version, a funny way of doing redoing the line. But when you're trying to convince me it's still a Regency version and you're not leaning enough into how kind of weird it and quirky it is to have modern lines but still be a Regency similar to how many Shakespeare plays these days are in modern dress, except they're still talking like they're from Shakespeare times. You can play around with it a bit. I just don't think this film did a very good job of it, and I think it turned out to be a bit of a mess. It was just a really bad blend of very dramatic lines and very just stupid sounding modern lines. Problem number 3, I honestly feel like they destroyed the central romance. This is kind of the point where, for me, this doesn't just fail as an adaptation, but it's not a great film because of this. Again, I will be comparing it to the book and the other adaptations, but I just don't think the central romance, which is important when, it's a romance film, I don't think it worked. So, I will compare it to the book. Basically, in the book, of course, Wentworth and Anne were engaged when they were young. They broke up and left him because he was poor. And then 8 years later, neither of them have remarried. But they meet again, and it's just very, very awkward and stilted, and they both kind of think that they hate each other. And it's, there's a kind of lack of communication, which is fueling this anxiety for both of them. And Wentworth is very proud, so he won't admit that he still loves her and wants her back after, she broke his heart. So there are a lot of kind of, I wouldn't necessarily say complex emotions, but there are a lot of emotions running high. There are a lot of issues. There's a lot of tension. That's the main thing. If you're going to have like a romance where the ending is them getting together, the tension really has to work, and you really have to like be just waiting and anticipating for them to get together. The problem is, in this adaptation, they talk about their past and become friends very, very quickly. Again, in other adaptations and in the book, they're very strained for a long time, and it's only towards the end, certainly past the second half, past the halfway mark into the second half, there is a moment where both of them talk about something in the past, and says something like that she has always enjoyed walking, and Frederick says, yes, I know, and it's basically them admitting that they do know each other very well and they do have a past together, but this is something that they can move past. They can keep going even though they've got all of this behind them, and they share this moment, and it's a huge deal of them being like, yes, we have this behind us, but we can move forward, and there's this kind of sense of hope that's generated. It's just an incredible moment when you have the build-up of this kind of awkward tension of them not knowing where they stand. So they have, the book and the other adaptations have this real tension that gets broken at one point. And this film doesn't have that, because they establish themselves to be friends pretty quickly. They talk about the fact that they have a past also very quickly. They call each other by their first names. So there is no distance between them to help build the tension. So, of course, in the original book, essentially all the issues could be resolved with one conversation, and they kind of are. They're resolved with a letter. But this whole thing of them still being in love but not sure about each other, yes, all of that can be resolved with a conversation. But in the book and the previous films, there is a reason why it's difficult for that conversation to take place, because of the heartbreak that is sitting there. In this film, it kind of feels like they talk to each other very easily, so you're not sure why they aren't talking to each other about what's going on. So the whole tension, the whole issue of the film where they can't resolve this issue because they can't talk to each other, that's gone in this film. They're just not talking to each other for no particular reason. It is issues based on miscommunication, which does not need to exist. And that is I just think it kind of ruins the central romance. We've got, it could be construed as a friends to lovers story, but personally I think that's a different story, which kind of requires different plot beats, different character development and character arcs. Talking about the past is an obstacle they need to overcome, but they just overcome it so quickly. It just quickly becomes a story about two people who kind of like each other and are kind of just biding their time. Also, just a little side note about the romance. So in this one, Anne is portrayed, I will come onto the characters a bit later, but Anne is portrayed as generally very smart and able to see through people. She understands people very well. But in this film, she kind of not falls for her cousin, but she takes a liking to her cousin who wants to marry her. It's the Regency era, just go with it, guys. Her cousin wants to marry her, and she takes a real shine to it. And it does mention once that she doesn't trust him, but later on it kind of suggests that no, she really likes him and she is considering him. And it's just really weird that basically he's kind of the bad guy at the end, and he's trying to ensure that he gets the title, and trying to, make sure that he gets the family money, because he will inherit from Anne's father. So he's trying to sort of play the family a bit, so he's quite manipulative. And again, other adaptations in the book, because Anne is very smart and can see through people, she sees through him. She doesn't want to be with him, she doesn't want to spend time on him, because she can see through him. At first, not so much, but eventually, yeah, she understands that she doesn't trust him, there's something going on. Whereas this, the way she kind of, she falls for him, it kind of, again, breaks Anne's character a bit. It kind of feels like, all the stuff about her being really intelligent and really intuitive, that's just not working here. Yeah, so that's just another thing. It's kind of linked to the romance thing of her falling in love with someone who's a bad character, but she doesn't see the bad character, even though she's supposed to be able to, which we're told in the film. I just didn't think that worked. I thought that was a bit of an inconsistency. Okay, again, so problem number 4, again, relates more to the book, but I still wanted to bring it up. So the book Persuasion, it's called Persuasion. It's all about the idea of a woman being fickle. The reason Persuasion was written was to kind of show how women aren't fickle. They don't just feel things randomly and go from emotion to emotion. It was all about proving that actually women can feel things very, very intensely, and can hold on to feelings for a long, long time, and sometimes feel things more intensely than men. Women aren't over-emotional or and aren't like uncaring towards people. Women can fall in love very, very deeply and remain in love for a long time. That is what the book... I suppose you could say it's what I personally feel the book stands for, but I do think that is an important element here, in that people think that women will fall out of love quickly, and Anne is very insistent that no, she will continue to be in love with the same person, and her love is enduring. Enduring love is an important theme throughout the book, and they do kind of bring it up in the film, although I don't think they do that much with it. It's a major theme in the book. It's mentioned a couple times in the film. And the film kind of completely does away with the issue that the book was, discussing. They bring it up once, and they don't really bring it up again. Again, this is more of an issue relating to the book, but I still care, and this is my review, so I will decide what I review. But yeah, I just think it's a real shame that this was a really important issue of like talking about women and women's emotions and thoughts and feelings. Because remember, before Jane Austen, no one was writing about women, and even this book famously has the lines of a man says, all works of literature would... It's not the exact line, but he says something along the lines of, all works of literature talk about the fickleness of women. And Anne says, yes, but they were all written by men. So this book is really important for giving a feminine perspective on things like emotions, of proving that women can feel things intensely. And this kind of just does away with the whole thing and doesn't talk about it at all. And it just feels really weird that a major theme of the book, something that arguably the book was named after, Persuasion, this idea that she was persuaded out of feeling for something, persuaded out of going through something, but her feelings could never be persuaded. She stayed in love. Her love was not persuaded away from her. So arguably what the book was sort of named after, it's not a huge thing in the film. Again, this is a book to film comparison thing, so it's not relevant to everyone. So if you still enjoyed the film in spite of this, that's fair enough. But as a reader of the book, I didn't enjoy it. Issue number 5 kind of relates to issue number 2. It's poorly written. This is not a well-written film. There is a lot of character inconsistencies. A lot of the humour doesn't work. This film has absolutely zero subtlety. I'll come on to that with the characters. But the so when she breaks the fourth wall, that is just used for exposition. It's not used for development or anything like that. It's just used to convey information. We are told way too much information. Also, one thing is, it's not just fourth wall break. Sometimes it's just narration. She's constantly talking to the camera. It's almost like they didn't have faith in Dakota Johnson to portray an emotion or a feeling or a scene. They had to have her tell us every single time. And even other characters where, they wouldn't let us get an idea of the character. They just tell us who the character is and then they portray that character. There is zero subtlety in this film, and there is no depth to basically... I'm struggling to think. There are a couple of characters which have a bit of depth, but barely anyone. It's not subtle at all, and it's very poorly written. Even line by line, it's not very well written. So many characters have to just break character for either plot to happen or for a joke to happen. Yeah, it's not that well done. One thing I will say about it, in fairness, I think the runtime is fine. It's just under 2 hours. It didn't feel particularly long. I will say that in the film's defence, it didn't feel like it went on and on and on. I wasn't enjoying it when I was watching it, but it's not like I was checking. I mean, towards the end maybe a bit, but I've watched other films where even if I'm enjoying them, I'm just waiting for it to end, and it feels like it's never ending. It helps that I'm very familiar with the story, so I watch the story move along and I know whereabouts I am in terms of what the story is. But I didn't think the pacing was a problem. Another issue I had, I love Birdie, the singer, but the music at the end completely breaks the immersion. I guess it was going with this anachronistic thing that they were going for, but I just don't think it works. But I did think that the ending scene reflecting the beginning scene is a nice touch. It's kind of, they come full circle, they've managed to repair their issues. I thought that was like a nice little thing. I do prefer, maybe would have preferred a little idea of them having developed from when where they first were. So this idea that they, broke up and then went through all of this and now they're back together, but they're not the same people they were 8 years ago. There has been development there have been changes there. But I actually don't mind the idea of this whole thing of they've come full circle, they're back together, they're kind of almost young again. They're, well, not young again, but they've overcome the obstacle that was keeping them apart, or various obstacles keeping them apart. So I quite like the ending scene reflecting the beginning scene. I thought that was fine. Anyway, I kind of want to talk about the characters for a while now. I am going to try and make sure this review isn't too long. Like I said, the characters have absolutely zero subtlety. Most of the characters feel like are built on cliches or were given one personality trait. All of the characters are either good guys or bad guys, apart from one or two, which I'll come on to. But it's just no subtlety, no shades of grey, even though Austen was very known for her character work. If you think of Pride and Prejudice, the whole basis of that book is people misjudging each other, and the people you thought you could trust, you couldn't, and the people you didn't like actually turned out to be fine. Jane Austen did a lot with character work about characters having depth, and I feel like this film completely did away with that. Again, it's if you didn't read the book, maybe you're not as attached to that, but still there is something to be said about a film where the characters feel like they don't have any depth. So let's start with Anne Elliot, our main character. Again, I love the book, so I love Anne as a character, so I wasn't so keen on the changes. They turned an important, complex character who represents a lot. Like I said, she kind of represents a lot in terms of going against the idea of women being fickle and over-emotional and not feeling things as intensely as men do. Anne Elliot is an important character for going against that idea, and instead in the film it felt like they turned her into a standard, witty sort of girl who is also an exposition machine. It feels like 90% of what Anne does in this film is just tell the audience what is going on. We do see how the breakup has affected her, but this just keeps her from being the kind of intelligent, hardworking, if meek woman that she was in the book. It kind of turns her into a sort of traditional breakup alcoholic. She's kind of a bit of a husk of a person in order to force comedy. They're clearly going for a Fleabag, Bridget Jones kind of thing. It just feels like turning a kind of complex character who, says a lot and fits really, really well into the story and really, really works as the protagonist of this story in the way that she, the other characters work around her. And this Anne just did not feel like the natural protagonist of this story. She did not feel like a woman who could have been persuaded out of marrying someone. She did not feel like the woman that her family depended on and yet ignored. She didn't feel like she fit into the narrative of this story. I will say in general, I do take issue, and I think some other people do, but some do like it, I will admit. I take issue with adaptations changing quite intelligent characters like Anne and Fanny Price from Mansfield Park into more outgoing, brave, witty characters. I would say meek and quiet characters can still have just as inspiring story arcs as rebellious, outgoing characters like Lizzie Bennet. I don't think you... I think a lot of people do struggle with this, but you can have a really quiet, meek, introverted main character who still has a very important development arc, and can still be very entertaining to watch, just the same as, you know, outgoing characters. Yes, you may have a preference yourself, but I don't think one is more or less valuable than the other. I also felt that in this adaptation at points, Anne just felt really, really judgmental, just judgmental of other people, but it just kind of turned her a bit unpleasant sometimes. I will say Dakota Johnson, a lot of people complained about her. I thought she was actually really good in the role. I don't think the character was well written. Her accent slipped a couple of times, but generally speaking, I think she was fine. I think she was well cast. I think my issue is she's not plain. So it talks about how like beautiful her sisters are. Dakota Johnson isn't like not beautiful. She's gorgeous. she's really beautiful. So them trying to sell her as this kind of less beautiful middle sister, no, that doesn't work at all. Not at all. At least in the books and other adaptations, the idea is she is a spinster and has no hope of marrying and stuff like that. And she's a bit quiet and a bit meek, so she's not a social. In this, she generally seems very, very confident. She's gorgeous. So it's one of these things where you struggle. It's tough to sell me on the character they wanted to sell me on. Not to say that, you know, beautiful people should never play main characters or anything like that. That's fair enough, but don't give me a beautiful character, beautiful actor, and tell me that they're plain. You know, that's that's not going to work. But yeah, I just thought the character didn't fit in very well. I have very little to say for our other main character, Wentworth. He does not have much personality to me. He kind of just appears. He's kind of just the love interest. He doesn't do much else apart from that. In the book, he is supposed to be kind of this proud man who clearly is still in love with Anne, but cannot admit it to himself. But, you know, he still cares for her in many ways. He's also, Wentworth is very, very charming. He's very outgoing. He's very social. People are drawn to him. People love him. He's incredibly charismatic. Meanwhile, Anne is very kind of quiet and obliging. She kind of not follows people around. She does know her own mind, but she will kind of help other people out. She's one for assisting other people. She still sticks up for herself, but that's just not who she is naturally. She's just a bit of a quieter person and, you know, prefers to make other people happy and help others, whereas Wentworth will kind of draw the crowd to himself. So they're very, very different characters, and they fit together really well, but this film really does not showcase Wentworth's like charisma or pride or his hidden affections very well. Again, because they become friends very quickly, you don't get this idea of him hiding these feelings, and you don't get the tension, and these two just did not have great chemistry. Other people will disagree. Some people did like the chemistry I saw on Twitter. I personally felt these two actors, I don't think they had great chemistry. I don't want to hold too much against Cosmo Jarvis, because who played Wentworth, because I think he was fine. I don't think he was bad, but obviously this character was poorly written. But he didn't really do much for the role, unfortunately, and it didn't do very well. Also around is Cousin Elliot, played by Henry Golding. I thought Henry Golding was well cast. I thought he did this role very well. I've forgotten his name as well, though. I just call him Mr. Elliot or Cousin Elliot. His last name is Elliot, not his first name, but I don't know what his first name is. It might also be Elliot, if I'm honest. It's terrible, because, like I said, I do love the book, but I can't remember this character's name. But he's important in the book. But yeah, I thought he was actually well done. Of all the characters, he might have been the one that was done the best. He was, he kind of went from this good, charming man into a villain. I actually think he and Dakota Johnson, he and Anne had pretty good chemistry. I thought their chemistry worked. There's a bit of subtlety there as he kind of gradually turns into this guy. He's slowly revealed to be this guy who is kind of manipulating the Elliots. I had no issues with him. I actually thought he was a good adaptation from the book. I thought he worked well in the film as a kind of villain. He wasn't, he's not the overarching villain. He's just not a particularly nice guy. He wasn't a completely faithful adaptation, but I actually think he was good. I don't have a problem with him. So moving on. Sir Walter, Mrs. Clay, and Elizabeth Elliot, who are basically Anne's family. They're very consistent with how the book characters are. They're pretty well adapted, I'd say. No issues. Some of the humour I thought was fine. I thought Richard E. Grant was actually very well cast. I think he was really, really good in the role. Just so self-absorbed. The humour didn't always work for me. Sometimes I think some of it actually genuinely was that Anne just does not feel like she fits into this dynamic. They changed her character so much that she doesn't work in this film. Unfortunately, it's a real shame because I do think Dakota Johnson could have done the original Anne Elliot character just fine and she would have fit in really well. But I would say actually Sir Walter, Mrs. Kay and Elizabeth, I think they're all fine. I don't have a huge issue. They're pretty one-dimensional characters in the book as well. They're one-dimensional in the film. They have some funny moments. But there's nothing. I have no issues with them compared to Mary. So Mary is Anne's other sister. She in this film is the biggest missed opportunity for me because I think people. I mean, again, this is a personal, subjective thing, but she's a bit of a weird character. So in the book, she's a complete narcissist, a complete hypochondriac. So the film did get that right. But she does have a bit more depth than that. First of all, she actually does care about Anne and she does defend her on a few occasions. She is the one who says to Anne, I think Wentworth was a bit ungallant towards you. I think he was a bit nasty towards you. She does show some concern over Anne. So of all her family, Mary is probably the one who is nicest to her. Also, this film kind of tried to make her look very, very manipulative, when actually I think in the book, I mean, again, it is subjective, but she was more she wasn't particularly intelligent, she was a bit stupid at times, and she was kind of desperate for attention for a lot of times. But I think one thing that they do, her character is good for pointing out, is that as soon as she is married, she is basically, all she is viewed as is the mother of her children. That's it. That is all anyone sees her as, is the mother figure. And she mentions a few times that it's unfair that she has to always be the mother, whereas her husband, Charles, he gets to leave at times. When their children are sick, she's expected to look after them, whereas Charles is allowed to go. So she, even though she's kind of an annoying character, she does point out some things that nowadays we would say are pretty sexist. This idea that she is defined by the children that she has, whereas her husband, not so much. He gets to kind of have his own life outside of being a family man. And also, there is this whole thing in the books where you have to remember, she was second best. Charles proposed to Anne first, Anne rejected him, and then he proposed to Mary. So there, she's one of these things where the adaptations don't do loads with her, but I think they're not as mean-spirited towards her as this one was, where they clearly wanted her to be manipulative and annoying and just a complete narcissist with almost no redeemable qualities. This was a character where you could have had a character who had a bit more depth, was a bit more interesting, or at least kind of was accurately adapted. Some people think that she was accurately adapted and she is just a narcissist. I disagree, but again, I'm not here to invalidate anyone's opinions. And also one thing I will say is that so she was played by T from Tracy Beaker. I can't remember the actress's name. I think Mia McKenna Bruce or something? I can't remember her name. I'm really sorry. I honestly think she was the best performance in this film. She was incredible. She sold this character. I mean, even though I didn't like the characterization, she sold it so well that this character was just a complete manipulative narcissist. That performance was amazing. Awards, please. Award. I mean, I don't really subscribe to award shows or anything, but no, I would never ever criticize the actor who played Mary. She was phenomenal. She just sold it really well. And the scene where so her husband is played by I know him as Doc Brown from Taskmaster. Again, love him. He's brilliant. I'm very glad that he's working and he's amazing. I have no complaints about him. The scene of him carrying Mary into the house and Mary telling Anne that they're going to Lyme in a few days and she refuses to be put down because she needs to be carried. First of all, I would say actually that is a lot of the humour surrounding Mary is very consistent with the character they set up in the film. This idea that she is a narcissist and she is self-centred. This is set up in the film and it is consistent throughout. In the film, I didn't like the characterization so much, but she's a very, very consistent character. She's very one-dimensional, but it's consistent, in fairness. But that scene of Doc Brown carrying Mary, it's the best scene in the whole film. It's so funny. It's hilarious. It did feel like something that Book Mary would do, so I quite liked. It was just that was really funny. Genuinely, I enjoyed that scene. There are some scenes that were quite good in this, and that was one of them. So next character I wanted to talk about, Louisa. What was her surname? I can't remember this. I love this book. I can't remember anyone's names. It's getting a bit late now. Louisa's character in this was so inconsistent, and then her character just disappears in the second act, which she does in the book as well and in other adaptations, but she's not as prominent in those adaptations, where in this one she was and then kind of disappears. So at first she's supposed to be very kind, intelligent and considerate. She wants Anne to pursue Frederick because she wants Anne to be happy. It does show quite well how Louisa goes from wanting Anne to be happy with Frederick to thinking, well, Anne and Frederick don't seem interested in each other, so and I quite like Frederick. And it shows that kind of transition pretty well. She does tell Anne about her feelings and Anne kind of encourages her and everything. So that transition is good, but it almost doesn't come back later, where Anne tells Louisa to pursue Frederick, which does not happen in the book. None of that happens in the book. But then Anne is the one who ends up marrying Frederick. Even though Louisa does marry someone else, it just feels like that was just a bit random, and they never talked about it again. And it just felt unnecessary, I think, for Louisa to say to Anne that she needed to pursue him, and then to say that actually she wanted to be with him, and then actually she was with someone else. It just kind of complicated something that didn't need complicating, and kind of added time that you didn't need. And I just didn't feel like Louisa in the film was just particularly consistent or made a lot of sense. She and Anne are supposed to be really close, but they just don't feel like it. The book emphasises how Louisa and Henrietta are both like really, really nice and sweet, but they're ultimately quite childish and naive. So in the book, Louisa's accident makes a lot of sense. She asked Wentworth to catch her when she's jumping off some steps, and he doesn't, and tells her to stop, and she falls. Whereas in this, they clearly wanted to just have a generic best friend character, so they kind of made her intelligent and nice and kind, but then it makes absolutely no sense why the accident happened and why she threw herself off the off the stairs, because she wasn't portrayed as like childish or proud or anything like that, or stupidly stubborn. They kind of just wanted a generic character, so it makes absolutely no sense why she jumped off the thing. And that's a major thing that happens in the film. That's not like just one incident. That is like a major plot point in the film. So that was it. Just doesn't have that not make sense, because they characterise this character a bit weirdly. I just don't think it was worth it. Also, again in the book, Louisa kind of has a moment where she criticises Anne for because she says Anne rejected Charles because Anne was persuaded by Lady Russell to reject him. So there's a kind of moment of Louisa appearing kind of a little bit two-faced because she wants to impress this guy a bit. Or at least just being really thoughtless and not caring what she says. And that's like a good moment of having a character who is nice and kind and everything, but also doesn't think about things, and have a character with just a bit of depth. But clearly they kind of wanted Louisa to be like this perfect character who's just her best friend. And it really doesn't help this idea that Anne is kind of she's quite isolated in the film. She's kind of supposed to be an alcoholic, but there just are people who are like really, really nice to her, which kind of almost doesn't make sense. Not that nobody was nice to her in other adaptations, but also Anne just really felt like someone, she couldn't talk to other people. She struggled. Nobody understood her. Whereas Louisa, it kind of feels like they're making her out to be really, really nice and everything, and so she's someone that Anne could talk to. It doesn't help this idea that she is like isolated and can't speak to anyone. So the Louisa character almost ruined some part of the films for me because, again, kind of like Anne, it just doesn't make sense in the way that they portrayed it. Fair enough if you're going to change characters a bit, but I think I changed it so much that she doesn't make sense as a character. Next character, Lady Russell. She's cool. I got no problems with her. They kind of blended Lady Russell and Harriet Smith from the book into one character. So Anne has this one friend who she goes to and gets advice from. But I'm fine with it, honestly. Shame I couldn't have Harriet, but you know what? If you have to cut things out, I think blending Lady Russell and Harriet together, I think that's fine. I didn't have an issue with that. Yeah, Lady Russell was cool. I had no problem with her. There are plenty of other characters in the film, but honestly, they just kind of mean nothing. They don't do much. They don't make much of an impression on me, so I'm not going to bother talking about them. So I've been complaining about this film quite a lot. I've mentioned a few things that I like, but I've been complaining a fair bit. But you know what? Like I said, this film is not without merit. I don't want to leave it on such a downer. I do want to talk about some things that I like. First of all, costumes. Impeccable. They even have bonnets and they didn't have a single corset joke. Thank you. Okay, if even a film like this can do it, other films and TV can do it too. Okay, you don't have to joke about corsets, and we can have bonnets. Bonnets are lovely. I wasn't so keen on the beret, but bonnets. They were great. Also, I generally thought the costumes were pretty accurate to the characters. You saw ladies who kind of dressed to impress a bit more, had these like huge poofy sleeves, these really elegant dresses, whereas sometimes Anne looked quite plain. They didn't kind of dress her up too much. I mean, that blue dress she wears I really liked. Again, there are dresses in this that I'd really like to recreate, and she still looked really nice, but generally I thought actually the dresses were pretty true to the characters. They had day dresses, they had evening dresses which looked different. I thought they were kind of not just I can't talk about how historically accurate they were. I'm not as educated on this. I can tell when dresses are really not historically accurate, but here it kind of, they generally looked like they were accurate, and I just thought the costuming great. Again, some of the performances were really good. Mary was very good. I thought Dakota Johnson was really good. Richard E. Grant was very good. Doc Brown I always love. He was pretty good in this. Generally speaking, yeah, really good performances. I don't have much of a complaint. I don't think there were any bad performances. There were some that weren't as good. There were some weak ones. I wouldn't say there were any objectively bad ones. I mean, nothing in this is objective, but I don't think there are any bad performances, is what I'm saying. Some of the film looks great. Some of it looks really, really beautiful. One thing I would say, I couldn't always tell whether or not the film had really interesting direction, or if everything just looks good because maybe the technology is very good. I would definitely say congratulations to director of photography because everything just came out looking really good. But sometimes it is kind of the tech and the setting and not necessarily the director doing a great job. But yeah, honestly, I thought it was. I thought some of it looked very good. The houses looked beautiful. Some of the settings were really, really nice. I would also say I don't have any complaints with regard to things like sexism or anything like that. Normally I do have issues with the way they portray some issues. I think they actually portray women's issues relatively well. They feel very natural in this, where they talk about, they do mention a few times the fact that Mary is expected to look after her children when her husband isn't, and they do mention once the whole fickleness argument, and that all appears very natural. It doesn't feel forced. Possibly could have done more, but honestly, I actually don't have any complaints in that regard. I actually think they felt very natural, very good. I thought it was done pretty well. It wasn't the centre of the film, certainly wasn't the focus of the film. But when it was included, I thought it was pretty good. I thought it was fine. I can't complain about that. And again, I said some of the scenes I actually do like. There were some scenes which were genuinely very funny. Some which are quite emotional, like I said, where to the scene I thought worked really well was when Dakota Johnson, Anne, is... I keep calling her Dakota Johnson because she's not Anne to me. But the scene where she's dealing with the fact that she thinks that Frederick is engaged to Louisa. So that moment, I think seeing her heartbreak, I think is well acted. I think it's well done. It references the film a bit earlier. It sort of talks about how she spends a lot of time drinking in the bathtub. So even though, again, I didn't like the characterisation, it was consistent. I'll give it that. So there are some scenes which work really well. There are some really funny bits. Unfortunately, these bits are intercut with some pretty terrible scenes and some pretty terrible lines. So it's harder to appreciate them, but I still appreciate that they're still there. So in conclusion... don't worry guys, you're nearly at the end. Honestly, if you like the film, fair enough. You know, we're not going to agree on anything. I despise it. I hate this film. I'm never going to see it again. It genuinely upset me enough that I recorded over an hour of a review of this. I could not stand it, but I'm very glad that I've kind of got it off my chest a bit. People will always have different thoughts on adaptations. Again, they are... creating their own piece of media, and it's always worth trying something a bit different and trying something new, something like that. But you know, you're capitalising on a fan base, so some loyalty to the fan base I feel like is kind of deserved. If you're, you know, telling people that you are making an adaptation of this, put effort into making sure it really is an adaptation. Some people do just kind of use the name to kind of sell something, to, you know, write generic rubbish and insert in certain place in this film. It felt like it was that. It felt like they just took the name Persuasion and then kind of wrote their own thing to a certain extent, with some really, really lazy references to the original idea, but then also kind of using the characters and adapting them poorly. That was my personal feeling of it, and I think with adaptations, we always do have a right to criticise and a right to compare to the book. But also, if you don't wish to do that and you wish to see it on its own thing, fair enough. I will still maintain that even without considering it as an adaptation, I don't think it particularly works as a film. I don't think a lot of the dynamics work. I don't think a lot of the plot beats work because of the way they've done the characters. It's not subtle. I don't think it's well written. I think they turn the main character into an exposition machine. So she tells us everything that's going on, doesn't let the audience interpret. So I still don't think it works as an adaptation. I don't particularly think it works as a film. But if you really like Persuasion, and also if you did like this version, even if you liked this but haven't read any of the other versions, I'd like to make a recommendation. There is a web series called Rational Creatures on YouTube. There are 5 episodes out so far. They're nice and short. They're ranging between about 2 minutes and about 7 minutes. Nice and short. It is a modernised adaptation of Persuasion. I think it's really cute. I'm really looking forward to series 2 coming out. So they've done series 1, which is the beginning of the book. So they are coming out with new episodes. I'm really looking forward to it. It's really cute. It's really fun. There are lots of very good web series out there. It's a shame not many people know this. But yeah, Rational Creatures. It's based on Persuasion. It's a modern retelling. It's very good. It's very cute, and I just wanted to shout them out. I really do enjoy that. So if you have enjoyed this film, or if you are a loyalist to Persuasion, it's a really, really cute series. Rational Creatures. I'll say it again. last little thing, I forgot to mention it in the review, but I did want to note it. So I really liked that the little bunny. But why was there a bunny in the film? Why was Anne always holding a bunny? So in The Favourite there were bunnies, but the bunnies meant things. Was it about Anne's spinsterhood, that they never mentioned, or was it about the fact that she is lonely and has no children, even though she certainly has friends that she seems to talk to? Can she only talk about her feelings to the bunny, even though she talks to the camera quite a lot and she talks to her friends quite a lot? What was going on? Why was there a bunny? Why was that choice made? Also, the bunny kind of disappears halfway through, so what happened to the bunny? Why was there a bunny? I don't know, and I don't know. I have not yet come up with an outro for this, so yeah, I'm gonna at some point come up with a way to end this podcast, but I'm just gonna stop recording now.